So this is the final lecture, and in Irish we have a phrase that says which means at the end of the day, the night comes. And so I do not think whether it's like all good things come to an end, or like this too shall pass. You take your choice. So the title I've given this talk is Homo Christus. So for me this represents the apex of spiritual evolution. So I want to look at this notion now, and we got a real expert in the room on this as well, Roger Marsh here, talking about the Übermensch, or the Sri Aurobindo's idea of the kind of the Superman. There are other terms for it, and so I'm just going to play around with a bunch of terms that represent, what the next stages of the evolutionary process would look like. So as I say, Sri Aurobindo, this beautiful Hindu mystic, who talked about the notion of a Superman, and which he defined as, he said, man is a transitional being. In other words, beings en route were evolving, and that was the term he gave to it, was the Superman. He and his his comrade, what was she called? The mother. Yes, yeah. And so Nietzsche came up with the term the Übermensch. Nietzsche, who talked about God being dead. But we misunderstand Nietzsche very often. We think that somehow this was an atheist who was trying to kill the divine. He wasn't. He was talking about kind of the disintegration of the spirituality, in a sense, and the death of God as we'd understood it in times past. So in some senses he's talking about the God that needed to die. So I'd been talking about this notion of the Übermensch in Nietzsche's thinking, and in some senses he's just saying what Meister Eckhart had said, 500 years before him. I pray daily to God to rid me of God. And so the Übermensch is the future possibilities that lie ahead of us. And the Gnostic Gospels were saying exactly the same thing, 2,000 years ago. In some of the Gnostic Gospels, they use the phrase, instead of saying a human being, they say the truly human being. And by the truly human being, they mean the being who's tapped into their divinity, not just somebody who's walking around in a space suit. And so again and again and again, you get kind of prescient kind of speeches about where we're supposed to be headed. And so Jesus would say it maybe most powerfully of all, where he would say the last homily he ever gave, or the last lecture he ever gave, was at the Last Supper. And when you read John's Gospel, there are 21 chapters in John's Gospel, 5 of them are dedicated to the Last Supper. So it's like he has 24 hours to live, and he's trying to unburden himself of as much teaching as possible. And of course, they hadn't a clue what he was saying. They still didn't get what he was saying. But one of the things he was saying is, I and the Father are one. I am in the Father, the Father is in me, I am in you, and you are in me. And he would say also the very same things I do, you will do, and even greater, because I'm going to send you the Holy Spirit. And so he's talking about this new stage of the human evolutionary trajectory. And so I believe there was a group of great souls came in at the same time, a kind of a contract group, and consisting of, there are various levels of it, like concentric circles, that when you drop a pebble in a pool. And so at the very core of it, I believe, you had 4 characters. You had Jesus, you had Mother Mary, you have Mary of Magdala, and you had John the Beloved, and that they represented the core group, the most advanced souls. And then they're surrounded by a crowd of fishermen who don't know their left hand from their right hand, eventually, until the Holy Spirit descends upon them. And so that ripples out to the young Jesus movement at some stage. And so these were the characters who, in some senses, came to kind of imprint Christ consciousness and what I call Christa consciousness, the feminine aspect of the divine, to imprint that on the human, evolutionary trajectory. So Jesus is already talking about that 2,000 years ago. And then you get modern mystics saying the very same thing. Now, as I said the very first day, I got my own theory. I'm at B here now, that my definition of the Holy Spirit is that the Holy Spirit is the divine womb in which embryonic Christ consciousness is marinated in the womb of divine love, and that is the function of the Holy Spirit. that the Holy Spirit is the kind of the environment or the womb in which Christ consciousness is actually conceived, marinated, and gifted to us. And the gifting is done then by Mother Mary. It is the feminine face of God that presents the gift to the world, you know, and that was the job of the original group. So the problem with incarnation, as I said at the very beginning, is that we willingly take a deep dive into forgetfulness. And there's a purpose to this. It's not just that we kind of lose our way and we forget who we are. It's that we agree to the limitations of incarnation, you know, that we're operating from these tiny little laptops we carry between our ears. You know, we who are cosmic beings are stuck into little spacesuits of 150 pounds. We who have cosmic consciousness are now operating with a little brain. And we who can grok the gestalt of divinity are now having to break it up into bite-sized pieces and process it sequentially, thus giving rise to the illusion of time. And then we have amnesia created by Ayala, the angel of birth that pinches the nostrils and the upper lip and creates these indentations to allow us to forget completely who we are and why we came. And then the journey back is the journey of evolution. And so we do this in order to, I think, and I'm sure all of you have experienced it, the nostalgic longing for home. At some stage in our lives, we all have this nostalgic longing and we don't recognize it. And so we make up love songs. And whether it's the Beatles or, you know, people like Zed Zeppelin or not good at music, Led Zeppelin. Every love song you hear is basically a love song to God. It's nostalgia for home. That's basically what it is. And we project it onto a whole bunch of different kinds of circumstances, to, you know, the old country, you know, or your spouse or whatever. We project these, but it's basically a longing for home. And we forget in order that we can rediscover our Buddha nature and to kind of re-experience again Christ consciousness. So we do this willingly, in order to drive much more deeply, you know, the realization of who we really are when we finally wake up. That it's not just a kind of it's not just that we were born into that realization and we kind of take it for granted. It is that we were born into the absence of that realization and we have to rediscover it. And so there's a very totally different relationship between a truth that has to be discovered and a truth which is self-obvious from the beginning. We have a totally different appreciation of it. So that's will be my theory of this Übermensch. Now I'm going to build in on a metaphor I've used this morning and yesterday about this trajectory back home. So again, I talk about this room with the three axes, an x-axis representing compassion, a y-axis representing freedom, and a z-axis representing total self-knowledge. And I look then at, you know, as we get lost in this journey, you know, how we navigate that axial system. And for Homo sociopathicus, the x-axis just represents service to self instead of compassion. And the y-axis represents addiction to power. So they have no freedom. There is no freedom for Homo sociopathicus because they're totally addicted to power. So they think they're free. They're the most spancelled, you know, and manacled group on the planet, because what they take to be freedom is mere kind of egocentric self-addiction. And then there's Z, for the Homo sociopathicus, is that they have no appreciation of who they really are. They've completely forgotten that they're bite-sized pieces of God, and so they're totally identified with the ego. Homo artificialis, Homo sociopathicus is attempting to create in order to have servants, kind of robotic figures for them. Homo artificialis, when you look at the x-axis, is there is no compassion there. They're in total service to the sociopathic masters. There's no compassion on the x-axis. They're totally in service of the sociopathic master. And when you look at their y-axis, there's no compassion. There's only programming. You know, there's no freedom. At least there is only absolute programming. They'll do what they're told to do. And on the z-axis, there is no sense of personal self. There's no permanent sense of self. You know, it's defined for the Homo artificialis. It's defined who he's meant to be or who she's meant to be today, and it'll change tomorrow. Homo sociopathicus is going to need something else from Homo artificialis tomorrow, and so it'll program a different sense of self into Homo artificialis tomorrow in order to kind of act out whatever the agenda of the day might be for Homo sociopathicus. And so the only will that Homo artificialis has is the will of Homo sociopathicus that has been programmed and implanted, you know, and managed throughout the day. Now you come to Homo spiritualis, and this is somebody who's waking up and therefore who's scoring really, really high on all three axes. This is somebody who has a lot of compassion, is in service to others. This is somebody who's experiencing a lot of freedom because they've substituted freedom for free will. Instead of just doing what pleases me, I'm going to do what pleases God. And their sense of self is moving much, much towards the realization that they're not just an ego, they're not a skin-encapsulated ego, they're not just relationships or professions or emotions or mentation, they're bite-sized pieces of God. So they're moving along that scale. But the high point of it, right up here at the back, where the three axes are maxed out, I'm going to develop a new term that I call Homo Christus, who is scoring maximally on all axes. And that's where we're intended to move to. And that was the entire mission of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ did not come to be crucified on a cross and die for our sins and wipe away the guilt of humanity and win us back from God. This notion of redemption is a ludicrous notion that the Father was buying back his children whom he had exiled and kicked out of the house, and now he's buying them back from Satan, and the price is he's got to sacrifice Jesus in order to do that. It's a ludicrous notion. I believe that if Jesus Christ had lived to be an old man, and dandled his granddaughter on his knee, he would have been no less effective in his mission. That it was the life of Jesus, you know, up to and including the way in which he harvested his death process, that it was the life of Jesus that said the prototype for what Homo Christus would look like and how every single one of us is meant to move. And so his age didn't matter. And his death only mattered in the sense that even his dying could be harvested to generate a prototype of what real love looks like, what real compassion looks like, what real identification with source looks like, and what real understanding of freedom looks like. So I would call that, you know, the movement into that, I would call that Homo Christus. So that's what I need to say about that space. So I'm going to skip section C and section D and go on to E, which is mapping science onto the 7 bodies of Hinduism. As you know, when you study science, that science is based on 4 elements: space, time, energy, and matter. You know, and Einstein very, very elegantly tied these together in his famous formula, E equals mc squared. So that encompasses all 4 elements of the scientific model. Now, at one stage, I tried to map this onto a Hindu cosmology. And so very, very briefly, if you've studied Hinduism, you know that there's this notion of 7 different levels of the body, that there's this physical body, they call it the gross body, which is vibrating between infrared and ultraviolet, between 400 and 700 nanometers. So we can see it, we can touch it and feel it. So that's the kind of the gross body. Above that, vibrating at a slightly higher level, is the etheric body, the body of the auras. And we got somebody in our midst today who can see those really, really beautifully. I can't see them, unfortunately. But to be able to see the auras, to see this kind of sheath of energy that surrounds the physical gross body, and so it's vibrating at a slightly higher frequency. The third level then would be the astral body. And the astral body is very, very talented because it is the body we inhabit when we're dreaming at night. And so it allows us to travel interdimensionally even. And so it is also the place where our emotions reside. So as you're experiencing anything emotionally, you're actually downloading energy from the astral level of yourself. And it is also a third function, is that it is the archive. Once you die physically, it is the archive of all of the experiences you generated during this incarnation, which is just ending. So it holds that in store for you, so that when you reincarnate, you pick up again. That's kind of imprinted as like hard copy on you. You don't need software anymore. It's part of the hardware when you come back again. So all of those lessons you've learned in the incarnation just ended. That's all waiting for you to kind of take aboard, and it becomes part of your hard drive, when you come back in again. So they're the functions of the astral body. Then you get up to the mental body, which is literally the place of ratiocination, and from where you download great ideas. It's Plato's ideal realm. It's where you have some great insights or great breakthroughs, even as a scientist or an artist, and you have these, all of a sudden you get these brilliant ideas and you wonder, where did they come from? And they came from that level of yourself, of your mental body. The level above that, and obviously is vibrating at a higher frequency even than the astral plane. Above that, you have the psychic body. I know you're experiencing the siddhis, possibly clairaudience, clairsentience, clairvoyance, telepathy, precognition, the psychokinesis, all of these things. You're operating from a much higher level of the self. And then you get to the soul self. And the soul self is this fractal of source, which is vibrating at a very, very high level. And it's sometimes called the higher self. And so some of your great intuitive flashes and some of your kind of divine inspiration are coming from that level of yourself. So if you want to talk about an Ubermensch or a super human being, you're really talking about that level of yourself. It pre-exists. The journey of evolution is somehow to kind of manifest that even at the physical global level, but you always have it. It's always there moving you, and it's eternal in its energy. No matter how many ways you divide it up, you never run out of energy. And so we had a great discussion at our table today, about this very thing. Susan started us off, with this discussion of what happens, when a soul incarnates. Is it devoting all of its soul energy to incarnation? And the answer is no, not at all. That the soul is an infinitely energetic system. And no matter how many ways you divide up infinity, you still have infinity. If you take even the natural numbers, the integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, off into infinity, and you take out a chunk of them, 1,000 of them, you still got an infinite number of integers left. You take out 10,000 more integers, you still have an infinite number of integers left. So no matter how much you take out from an infinite source of energy, you haven't diminished the infinite source of energy. And so the soul, even if it's experiencing parallel lifetimes, if right now your soul is playing many roles in parallel universes, as many different characters, you haven't diminished your soul force at all, because your soul is always in the sight of God. So there's part of you that's always there with God. And Hinduism will call that part of us, it call it Atman. And then the part that incarnates, it calls Jiva. And Atman and Jiva are in constant contact with each other. So you can contact, Jiva can contact Atman through prayer, or through petition of some kind, or meditating in some way. And Atman is constantly contacting Jiva through intuitive flashes or deja vu experiences or sudden insights or synchronicities. So there's this extraordinary flow, this two-way flow between your soul self, and your physical self. So what I wanted to do then was to say, could I map, the sciences onto this model and see how far they can take us and at what stage they're going to break down. So at the system then has these chakras, these reducing valves. So if you were to go to Europe, for instance, and you were to take your hairdryer with you, here we use 120 volts, and you plug it into an outlet in Ireland, you're going to blow the system, because we operate, on 220 in Europe. So you plug in your hairdryer, you're going to blow it. Now that's the function of the chakra system. You can't take divine energy, and translate it into incarnation without blowing the systems. So you have to step it down sequentially, from the source self to the soul self to the psychic self to the mental self to the astral self to the etheric self to the physical self. So it's stepping it down, gradually, so that the physical body can handle the amount of energy, that's driving it. Otherwise, we blow all of the systems. So what happens then when we look at this model and we begin to think, as we work our way back up that system, that evolutionary trajectory, what happens to the scientific elements? So at the physical body, obviously, all 4 elements hold true. You're in space, you're in time, you're experiencing matter, and you're experiencing energy running through the system. Now, when you get to the etheric body, there's an energy obviously there, but it's like the other three elements are more fragile. And certainly, when you get to the astral body and you're dreaming at night, something extraordinary happens. You're out of space completely, you're out of time completely, and matter doesn't exist at this stage. So you've lost three of the elements already, just by dreaming at night or going into an altered state of consciousness. So I shared an example of a dream I had some months ago, where I'm with my grandfather, Daddy Jim, who died in December 1956, and I'm visiting with him in my childhood bedroom. So it's 67 years ago. I've traveled 6,000 miles to the east, and I've traveled 66 years in the past. So time did not exist for me, and space did not exist for me. And, you know, I begin to realize, am I dreaming? And to test it, you know, I put my hand against the bedroom wall and I push, and my hand goes through the bedroom wall. There is no matter. And so okay, I know I'm dreaming now, because there is no time, there is no space, and there is no matter. So it's a totally different form of energy. And so as we move up the scale, then we're moving away from a model, a scientific model, which is predicated on our physicality. So it's very important for us, as we're inhabiting spacesuits, that we operate with these four factors, but to realize that they do not define us. They only define a particular level of our self-identification. So we move up through these various realms, and for instance, by the time we get to the astral level, we've lost three of them already. Space is no more, time is no more, matter is no more. Now we get up to the mental body, the place, the ideal realm of Plato, and again we're dealing with a different form of energy. When we get up to the psychic realms, the psychic body, now we're going to kind of begin to experience all of these siddhis. And so, for instance, you may experience clairaudience. And clairaudience is telling you that space doesn't exist, because you're hearing something at a distance. You experience clairsentience. You will feel something which is far away from you. So space doesn't exist. Clairvoyance, you're seeing stuff at a distance. Remote viewing, you're seeing stuff at a distance. So obviously, space does not exist at the psychic body level. You have precognition. You're prescient, and therefore time does not exist. You're able to see what is a future event when you're in your physicality. And at psychokinesis, which is the ability to move matter with the mind, you have control over matter. So matter is different or doesn't exist whatsoever. And therefore, when you get up to the soul level, you don't need space, you don't need time, don't need matter, and there's a very, very different kind of an energy. And by the time you re-identify with source, there is only unit of consciousness and unconditional love. That's all that remains. So our scientific equipment and our scientific knowledge is vitally important for incarnation, but it's not going to carry us very far unless we kind of add on these other elements and these other levels of body. A few weeks ago, I had this kind of insight. I love to play around with stories and parables and metaphor. So this metaphor came to me, the metaphor of water as consciousness. And so where I live about half an hour from here, and I live literally on a mountaintop in the middle of the forest, and there's just a dirt road that comes in to my home for the last 3 miles. I'm literally driving along the edge of a cliff. So I'm really remote. So I got my own water source. I have a well which goes down 260 feet. I got solar panels. I got my own septic system. And so I live off-grid completely. But water is a hugely important element, obviously. So right on my property, there's a tiny little spring that bubbles up from underground. And it flows down a very, very steep ravine. And it joins a little creek called a Chapman Branch. And Chapman Branch flows for about 1 mile, and it joins a slightly bigger creek called Pena Creek. And Pena Creek flows for several miles, and it joins Dry Creek, after which this road here is called West Dry Creek. It joins Dry Creek, which is a bigger river. And Dry Creek flows into the Russian River. And the Russian River flows into the Pacific Ocean at a little town called Jenner. Now, so I'm looking at the quantity of water that I can see at each stage of this process. there's only a tiny trickle of water, at the spring. There's a slightly bigger one at Chapman. There's a bigger one yet at Pena Creek. It gets bigger when it enters Dry Creek. It's much bigger when it reaches the Russian River, and it's huge when it reaches the Pacific Ocean. And I had this vision of an ET landing somewhere in the Indian Ocean, like Sri Lanka, landing in the ocean, and then deciding to do a world travel, and confiscating a huge big ocean-going liner and taking a southwest direction and sailing until it reaches the Cape of Good Hope, at the southern tip of southern Africa. And now the Indian Ocean is going to become the Atlantic Ocean. And so it rounds the Cape of Good Hope, and it keeps its trajectory going southwest. And after a few thousand miles, it's going to reach Cape Horn, which is the southern tip of South America, Tierra del Fuego. And now it rounds that cape, and it finds itself in the Pacific Ocean. And now it starts going north, and it's hugging the coast of South America and Mesoamerica and North America. And it comes up the coast of California. And at some stage, it's going to reach a little town called Jenner, and it's going to see the Russian River coming in from the right. Now, in order to kind of navigate the Russian River, there's no way you can go on an ocean liner. So you've got to trade vessels at this stage. You're going to have to get off the liner. You'll get into maybe a motorboat, and you start taking a motorboat up the Russian River. But at some stage in the Russian River, the motorboat isn't going to manage because the draft is too shallow. So you're going to trade it out for a canoe. And there's a lot of canoeing actually happens in the Russian River near Healdsburg. So now you're paddling your way in a canoe through the town of Healdsburg. And at some stage, you're going to get to a Dry Creek. And to get onto Dry Creek, the kayak isn't going to work for you anymore because it's too shallow. So now you're going to have to get a little rubber dinghy that floats right on top of the water. You've got to paddle your way up to Dry Creek. And you get to Pena Creek, and at this stage, you'll have difficulty even with the little rubber dinghy. And so you're going to be wading in water, pools of water until you get to Chapman Branch. When you get to Chapman, you're just stepping from pool to pool to pool. You can't take any vessel whatsoever. And then you get to My Spring, and you're literally climbing up the side of a mountain, and you're stepping from one kind of rock to another, a little bit of water in each. Now that's what the journey looks like. The water is diminishing again and again and again as you come from the Indian Ocean all the way up to My Creek. So that's what's happening as we're allegedly waking up, as we're coming from the soul self from the source self to the soul self to the psychic self to the mental self to the astral self to the etheric body to the physical body. You're trading in vast amount of consciousness for lesser amounts of consciousness. So the trick is somehow to start off with a little trickle of water and then have the courage to clamber down the ravine and find myself in Chapman, and then wade down Chapman until I meet, Pena Creek, and then start swimming or wading down through Pena Creek until I reach Dry Creek, and then going through Dry Creek until I reach, the Russian River, and then finally come out at Jenner and I find myself in the Atlantic. And what I realize is that it's artificial. We've artificially divided up the waters of planet Earth into oceans. There's only one body of water. There are land masses somewhere in that body of water, and we artificially divide them into the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. There's only one body of water. And this one body of water, it means there's only one body of consciousness. That's divine source. And we've artificially divided up into these various groups of water, Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism, our own little ocean of spirituality. But there is only one body of water. And dry land is merely kind of the eruption of kind of the physiosphere into the kind of the water, this water planet of ours. And so the interesting thing is that you would think, that as we abandon our physical bodies and we begin to dream or go higher, that we should be experiencing lesser and lesser amounts of consciousness. You would think that when you go to sleep at night, you should be less conscious than when you're awake. And the truth is you're not. You're more and more conscious as you go deeper and deeper and deeper into altered states of consciousness, until finally you arrive in the ocean of God's love, and then you're bathed in it. And then there's this extraordinary cycle of evolution, devolution that happens, because what you realize is that the tiny little bubble of water that's trickling down the ravine near my home, it's coming from an underground reservoir that's been seeded by the snow melt from the Sierra Mountains many, many miles away from me. And what is snow? It's a form of precipitation. And so both water and snow are the oceans recycling themselves. So my tiny little creek that flows down to Chapman, into Pina, into Dry Creek, into the Russian River, into the ocean, is being recycled back up and is being dropped as snow and water. And so it's coming right back around. And that is the evolutionary, devolution and evolution trajectory, that there is nothing but God being recycled. And sometimes there's lesser consciousness available to that realization, and sometimes there's more consciousness available for that realization. But that is the ultimate truth, that there is only God, and that altered states of consciousness bring more and more awareness to us rather than less and less awareness to us. So that's what waking up, I believe, really looks like. So enlightenment then is having the courage to clamber down the ravine near my home and wind up, in the Pacific or in the water body of life. And so this is the journey then of disidentification with lesser bodies of water and re-identification with greater bodies of water, to disidentify with lesser versions of consciousness and to re-identify with greater versions of consciousness. And so the way I finally put it is this, that life is a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that God is having. There is nothing except God. We're denizens in God's dream. Namaste. The great question. So Marie's question was, she wanted to talk some more about the notion of emergent evil. How come, if we're, from God originally, how come that there's such darkness, that we experience such darkness? Was the origin. So the important thing to realize is that it's an emergent phenomenon. This is not native, to the design itself. And so I've used various metaphors in the past to talk about, what emergence looks like. So one of my favorite metaphors to illustrate this is, I don't know if you've ever come across the poem, The Touch of the Master's Hand. It's a story about an auctioneer who's auctioning off all the kind of the goodies in a home which is up for sale. And they're auctioning off, the beds and the kind of the furniture of various kinds. And finally, there's an old battered violin that's left. And he picks it up and he says, what am I bid for this old violin? And everybody starts laughing. And somebody finally says, $2. $2 going once, $2 going twice. And somebody says, I'll give you $3 for it. Okay, $3 going once, $3 going twice, going. And all of a sudden, there's this old man at the back of the room. And he walks up and says, can you hand it to me for a moment? And he's handed the violin, and he tunes it, and he looks at the bow, and he starts playing music. And he plays this extraordinary tune, and then he hands it back, and he walks away and disappears. And there's stunned silence in the room. And the auctioneer says, what am I bid for this violin? $2,000, $3,000, $3,000 going once, $3,000 going twice. And somebody said to him, what made the difference? And the auctioneer said, it was the touch of the master's hand. Yeah. So a violin is crafted to produce, symphony and beauty. In the hands of a neophyte, it's going to be scratchy. It'll be cacophony multiplied by 10. And so the instrument that was built in order to produce great music now is venting this just screeching sound. And so it's the touch of the master's hand. This thing was created to produce music, and that is our journey. Souls evolved in order to create a cosmic symphony. But the soul has to be recognized, and the soul has to be kind of identified with, because as soon as we identify with the ego, we're kind of neophytes scratching on a violin and creating cacophony for everybody. So that's what I mean by emergent. The violin was not crafted in order to produce cacophony. The violin was crafted in order to produce absolute beautiful music, and in the hands of a master, that's what it will do. And so even in our world then is kind of a misidentification of self, and therefore a resultant cacophony, which results in a total lack of compassion, addiction to power, and identification with the ego. And now we're going to make all kinds of selfish decisions. And now babies are going to be born into a world which has seen the sequelae, the consequences of thousands of generations of human beings living on planet Earth and making violent and kind of selfish choices. And that, for me, is what original sin really means, that we're birthing our babies into an environment where they're being given rules and roles about, you know, how to behave and what to think of somebody who comes from a different caste system or a different class system or different economic model or different IQ level or whatever it is. So we get all these artificial kind of rules that cordon us off into these subgroups, which are kind of then trained to be xenophobic. And now, so then the violence is going to increase. And so evil emerges just very, very gradually, but it was not the original design. And the way out of it is for individual people to begin to re-identify with the source self and the soul self, and then to form little communities that kind of challenge each other to identify as communities with the soul self, and to begin searching for our divinity as communities, and then creating a lattice work of communities that are all connected to each other. I think I gave this, I don't know if I said it in this retreat or not. This image I have years and years ago, I did my family tree, and as far back as I could go. And I then created a visual representation of the family tree. And initially I could see, you know, there are 4 ways of looking at this map of a family tree. The first one was to look at the number of people it took to produce me. And so in some sense, there's a very simple formula, 2 to the power of n. If n is equal to 1, 2 to the power of 1 is 2. So I had 2 parents. 2 to the power of 3 is 8. I had 8 great-grandparents. And so you can figure out very easily, go back just 10 iterations, and it took almost 1 million people to create me. Yeah. And so I'm looking at this extraordinary global effort to produce myself. I'm thinking, wow, I must be a really special guy. Look at all the people it took to create me. So that's one way of looking at that map. The second way of looking at that map is, if I had children, which I don't, unfortunately, because I love kids. If I were a father and I would look at, you know, I look at my children and my children's children and my great-grandchildren, whatever, I look and say, look at what I produced. And now so everything is coming from me. The first one, everything came to me. Now everything comes from me. That was the second way of looking at this map. And the third way was to look at it like an egg timer, or what do you call it? What is this shape? What's the word? An hourglass. And so everything is coming to me, through me, and from me. Now there's the third version, you know, I'm the focal point of this entire endeavor. And then the fourth way is realizing that everybody on the map could say the very same thing. It all led to me. It all came from me. It all came through me. So every single person on the planet could do a family tree. And what you realize is it's actually a matrix. And there's like 8 billion, you know, neurons on this matrix right now, each of whom can make the same claim, but each of whom needs to realize we're living in this divine matrix in which we're all interconnected. So as I come to the realization as an individual person that I am God in human form, and so is everybody else you encounter, and so is every other sentient being in the universe, including oak trees and bunny rabbits. And then I can say namaste, the divine in me, or as Kaji loves to say, namaskar, that the divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. And now we begin as communities to recognize that in each other. And now we're creating this lattice work of individuals who are alive, creating communities which are alive, which are creating matrices which are alive. So that's the journey back, I believe. That's to start with the individual, you know, birthing God in themselves, and then creating communities that are birthing God within the community, and then creating a lattice of such communities that are birthing God at a global level, and finally even at a cosmic level. If we finally meet our, you know, our space brothers and sisters, we can offer them namaste as much as we offer it to each other, you know, who are from the same planet. Great question, Mary.
I am really interested in this concept that you brought forward about the nostalgia for home and a longing for home. And there's a Welsh word called hiraeth, which is Hiraeth, which means, I guess you could loosely translate it into English as having this longing and this yearning to come home. And it makes so much sense to me personally, because I am like the descendant of colonists in Australia, which is not, it was once upon a time we had Indigenous culture and Indigenous people flourishing here, and they're starting to come back, and we're starting to see that beautiful flourishing again. But there was a lot of oppression of culture for a long time. And then, of course, in Ireland, I mean, we have this huge understanding of the colonialism there, and how people, language and culture was suppressed. And you suggested that the way for us to come home is to disidentify with our mortal coil, essentially. But I feel like that's really, really hard to do. Like it's hard to say I'm not this or I'm not that. Or, I mean, for me, I sort of feel a longing for somewhere that's outside of Australia, and I turn to Ireland, I turn to where my ancestors come from, and I think that's the answer. But you're saying that that's actually not the answer. The answer is actually beyond culture. Is that sort of, could you speak to that, Seán? I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say about the longing and how do we fulfill it, because it's so hard to go, oh, okay, well, we're all bits of God, so that's it.
It's a brilliant question, Amy. Did everybody hear that? Okay, brilliant question. And you need to know that Amy is an expert on Celtic mythology, and she's actually arranged a great dialogue between myself and a druid. We've had one session already together, and we'll do another session together. So Amy is expert on Celtic mythology and Celtic spirituality. So this is coming from a real deep place in her. So I should be asking you the answers to the question, Amy. But here's my best response to it. And the response is this: that there are two forms of disidentification. One of them is called turia in Buddhism, and the other is called turia. Turia means that I realize that I'm a witnessing consciousness, I'm pure awareness, witnessing an incarnational experience, but I don't identify with the incarnational experience. I'm a witness or an observer of the fact that here's a soul pretending to be Seán, in this particular incarnation, but I'm not going to identify with Seán. I'm going to realize that I'm an eternal being playing the role of Seán right now. So that's called turia. But turia is the ability to be both the witnessing consciousness and also the participant. It is the participant observer in cultural anthropology. And that's the realization: I volunteer to be a human being, and I'm going to give it my very best shot. And in this case, I volunteer to be an Irishman, and with a Cork accent. And I'm doing my damnedest not to lose my accent. And so I'm dedicated to playing this role to the best of my knowledge, but at the same time, to not identify with it completely, because that level of remembering is genetic. It has to do only with my cultural upbringing and my genetic heritage. I'm as far as I can go back. When I look at my 23 and me, I'm 96% Celtic and 4% Neanderthal. literally. Right. And so, genetically speaking, this spacesuit has a longing for Ireland and a longing for the Celtic. So that's one level of nostalgia for my genetic heritage. But there's a deeper level of nostalgia, which is for my divine heritage. And so the trick comes to be able to walk both, to be able to honor my Irishness, and at the same time realize that that's only a role I'm playing, and to even much more importantly, honor my divinity. Yeah. And for me, then that becomes the importance of reincarnation, because I know that I've been Hindu in past incarnations. I know that. In the last incarnation that I recovered, after a 4-hour hypnotic session with my good friend, Matt McKay, I found that I was a young Russian soldier on the Eastern Front in 1944, attempting to liberate a concentration camp of women and children. And realizing during this that I saw this woman behind a barbed wire fence, that I knew was my soulmate. And reaching out to try and liberate her and being shot in the process. And realizing that as we reached out to each other, I was dying, and she was, at some level of her, knew I just lost my soulmate. Maybe not the first time, maybe I don't know how many times since. And at that stage, I was just, a young soldier in the Russian army doing a job, and the sequela to that hypnotic regression was that even though I was only a private in the Russian army, I found myself with a German officer who had also been killed in the same exchange of fire, a whole bunch of souls leaving the battlefield at that very, very moment. And this bedlam and chaos and fear of various kinds as they're kind of vacating their spacesuits. And I remember with this German officer organizing the entire group and saying to them, it was a dream. You're not dead. This was a drama you agreed to play in this particular life. You're not German and you're not Russian. You're an eternal being, and trying to guide them on the journey home to this realization. And so for me, it's the realization that I've identified with different kinds of spacesuits, and I'm sure I experienced the same level of nostalgia for being a Russian, or at one stage, I remember kind of recapitulating a lifetime as a druid, in ancient Ireland. And so that's part of what I can identify us with as well. So I want to make sure that my nostalgia has two levels of longing. The first level is from my genetic heritage, and that changes from incarnation to incarnation. But the deepest longing of all is the longing for our real home. And they're not mutually exclusive. So Roger is making the observation and asking the question about, if you talk about Homo sociopathicus and Homo artificialis, and you think about at what level do we give up our freedoms, allegedly for the common good, like with this recent, he mentioned that, you say yes to a driver's license, and you say yes to a passport, and maybe you say yes to getting kind of the COVID jab or whatever. So at what stage do you continue to surrender freedoms in order to kind of purchase some kind of security? And at what stage do you say no? And how do you say no? It is the great existential question of our times, as far as I'm concerned. Because as the pressure comes on and more liberties are being taken away from us, there's this human beings are very, very kind of tempted always to trade, liberty for security, to give up our freedoms for alleged security from the enemy. And very, very often, cabals and oligarchies of various kinds will actually create artificial scenarios. And then the populace will cry out for save us from this situation, whatever the situation is. And then the cabal offer a solution which has already been thought out. Because in some instances, I'm not saying every instance, but in some instances, they've actually manufactured the crisis to begin with, so that we'll call out for assistance, and that we'll be prepared to give up our freedoms for a temporary security, which they'll get back to us when the situation is over. But those freedoms are never restored. When you look at tyranny throughout the ages, the giving away of our freedoms are never voluntarily given back to us by tyrannical regimes. So at what stage do you say enough is enough? And how do you protest it? And what is the difference between revolution and evolution? In the sense that when you respond violently, you create violence, and then you become a violent person. And so you look at the great teachers of our times, the Jesus Christ, the Buddha figures, the Mahatma Gandhis, the Nelson Mandelas, that these were extraordinarily courageous human beings, who stood up to tyranny, but they did it non-violently. And so what is the expression of non-violent evolution and revolution for our generation of people right now? And for me, it means the beginning of the creation of decentralized communities which are handling their own finances, their own economics, the education of their own children, the healing of their own disease processes, their own forms of entertainment, their own forms of spirituality. So many months ago, I created actually a manifesto. I call it the Manifesto of the Lightbringers, that the the job and the mission of the lightbringers is to take entertainment away from Hollywood, is to take democracy away from the politicians. It is to take religion away from Mecca and from Rome. It is to take healing away from big pharma. It is to take agriculture away from big agriculture. It is to take storytelling away from the mass media. You know, so one by one outlined where I thought the jackboot is coming down on top of us, because you know at some stage those who try to live under the radar are going to start living under the jackboot at some stage. So how and when do we respond to this greatest crisis of our times? And I believe that this particular generation of human beings volunteered to be here now. We didn't kind of parachute ourselves into a situation and say, holy crap, you know, I came at the wrong time, the wrong place. Get me the hell out of here. We didn't. We knew, you know, the exact state of the world we were parachuting into. We knew the kind of the character of all of the other players in the drama right now, from the tyrants who are manufacturing this to the kind of the Mother Teresa's, you know, at the other end of the scale. We knew that and we volunteered for that. So now we're here. And now we're here because we chose to be here. I know the pressure is coming on and we're experiencing a form of oppression, you know, that other generations at other times have experienced in different ways. So the question is, okay, what do we do about that? And this manifesto that I created said, you know, here are the ways in which we need to kind of take back our freedoms. And what is that going to look like? It's going to look like a lot of personal courage to stand up to people who think differently, you know, and who think that we're a scourge on the planet because we're not accepting that what their version of reality is. But it means dialogue, because I have no guarantee that my version of reality is the truth and that the one that I'm, you know, confronting is not the truth, unless there's some form of dialogue. But it's very difficult to do a dialogue when there's censorship on one hand and propaganda accompanying it. That I'm not allowed to express my opinion and I'm being propagandized with the alternative perspective. It is very difficult at that stage to engage in any kind of meaningful dialogue. So the alternative for me is, you know, forming communities, finding your tribe, not in the sense of being xenophobic, but you need to be encouraged, you know, in your journey of evolution and revolution, peaceful revolution. And what is that going to look like? It's going to like maybe small communities such as this one right now, trading ideas and saying, you know, here's what I found worked, you know, could we try this? Here's what we've been practicing, maybe you should try that one. And that slowly by slowly, we're building a networking system because we're far more powerful than the tyrants, for the very simple reason that we're far more numerous than the tyrants. The question is, do we have the cojones to stand up and to say no to various injunctions and various mandates? And that's going to be done on a person-to-person basis and on a community-to-community basis. Yeah. Yes, Roger.
Back to the subject of the nostalgic longing for home.
Okay.
Is there also a calling to come home, like an ancestral calling that I need to be, or we need to be open to hearing?
That's brilliant. There is, Joe. And so what I call the preconception contract, which is an agreement of a bunch of souls to come in around the same time and to form particular kinds of relationships, like father-child relationships or brother-sister relationships or lovers relationship or whatever, that we come up with this contract. But I believe that built into every preconception contract are several possible exit stages. And so as the soul is navigating through an incarnation, it's provided with several different possible exit strategies and exit times. But it's not up to the ego to decide which one to take. It's up to the soul to determine which one to take. So I mentioned yesterday or the day before, you know, I've encountered in my life so far 3 possible exit strategies. The first one in Kenya, where I'm living in a very, very remote area, you know, and I get malaria at least twice a year. I'm treating myself for malaria, but I don't have malaria, but I don't realize that. I have typhoid and I'm dying from typhoid, you know, and I had this, luckily somebody came by. I would see another missionary maybe once every 3 months. And somebody came by and saw the condition I was in and yanked me out to a hospital, and I was actually shipped home to Ireland. So obviously that was an exit strategy that the soul said, no, it's not your time to go, you know, soldier on. I survived it. The second one was when I bought my property up here in Healdsburg. I was living in a cabin which was built in 1884 by a family called the Derricks, from whom I bought it. I bought it in 1994. And I was living in a little cabin, a tiny cabin, and I had a propane refrigerator that used gas and had a vent out through the back wall. But the vent got blocked up. So I'm there on the 26th of January, 1999. My nearest neighbor is 2 or 3 miles away. And I'm feeling really, really, really sick. And I drag myself into my bedroom and I think I'm dying. And I start singing Irish hymns. Okay, here I am, take me out. And I got a phone call from my soulmate, Arlen, who was living down in San Rafael. And she and I were supposed to meet in Healdsburg the next day to sign a part of the contract with the family from whom we bought the land. And I phoned her and I said, I'm not going to be able to make the meeting. And she said, what's the problem? And I told her what was happening. And she's a naturopathic physician. And she said, get the hell out of the cabin right now. She recognized the symptomology from over the phone. And she phoned a neighbor of mine who lived 5 miles away, John Delisle. John came in, yanked me out and took me now to Healdsburg Hospital. And Arlen came from San Rafael with a homeopathic remedy because she knew exactly that I was carbon monoxide poisoning. And in the hospital, the doctors were asking me, what do you think the problem might be? And I said, I think it could be a brain aneurysm. This is the 5th anniversary of my sister's death. My sister Ethna died on the 26th of January in 1996 of a brain aneurysm. I think I said, that's what's happening. So they're looking at that, and there wasn't a laboratory in Healdsburg Hospital. So they're having to send my blood work to Santa Rosa. So it took them 6 hours to get the results back, and it was carbon monoxide poisoning. But in the meantime, Arlen had arrived with the homeopathic remedy and given it to me. And within 24 hours, I was discharged from the hospital. So there was exit strategy number 2. And that obviously wasn't my time. And the soul said, no, it's not your time to go. You got more work to do, keep going. And the third one was I rented an apartment in Menlo Park because I was spending half of my week in Healdsburg, where I lived, and half of my week down in the Bay Area because I had a psychology practice in Los Altos, and I was saying mass for my community companions on the journey, 3 days a week. So I'm between the 2 places. And I have a real love for Indian food, hot, spicy food. And I used to eat really late at night when I'm finished counseling, get a big Indian meal taken home from me, gorge myself in the Indian meal. And I used to suffer from acid reflux quite frequently. So I'm asleep, it's about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I wake up and I can't breathe. And what has happened is somehow I've aspirated, and regurgitated some bile, and it's blocking my trachea. And it's like the sensation was when I'm trying to breathe in, it goes like this, and I'm breathing out, it goes like that. But I can't expel air, and I can't get air back in. And a voice in my head says to me, you have 30 seconds of consciousness left. Do something about it. Now, I thought about this quite frequently. Is it possible to do a Heimlich on oneself? And I figured out it is. So I get out of bed, I go into the bathroom, I take a bath towel, I put it over the edge of the wash basin, and I fire myself against it, hitting myself here. And in the 3rd stage, up, whatever was blocking it, let go. And my entire body is covered in sweat. And I go to my office and I sit down and I write my will. So, okay, this has been the 3rd chance. You have no will, write a will, buddy. But it's like, as clear as day, a voice said, you have 30 seconds of consciousness left. Get out of bed and do something about it. So far, I've had 3 exit possibilities. And obviously, the soul said, it's not your time. And so to answer your question directly, Joe, yes, this nostalgia for home is balanced by the realization that the soul self is saying, while the body wants to go back home and is nostalgic for you, for home, your mission is not complete. You've got work to do. So no, you're not taking this exit. And so I don't know what the final exit is going to look like. So yes, there are exits built into the strategy. I'm not going to give an opinion about finances because I know nothing about it. All I'm going to say is that we certainly need to reorganize, as I said, every single facet of the present system because it's not working. Money was invented by the Sumerians about 5,000 BCE, and it's gone through a very interesting trajectory. The Sumerians gave us marriage, they gave us divorce, they gave us adoption, they gave us mathematics, they gave us geometry, they gave us writing of various kinds. We're deeply indebted to them, but they also gave us money. which was the kind of and originally were just tokens of value representing, real stuff in the real world. And at some stage, I believe it was about 1971 in this country, I think it was President Nixon, who kind of separated gold from our currency. And so the present American currency is not based on gold. And my understanding is that, the value of the gold we hold, there's at least 10 times more currency, floating around than the actual value of the gold we hold. So the banking system is a Ponzi scheme, and it has been since the beginning, because, they're trading money that doesn't exist. And they're giving, they're charging you for the privilege of holding your money while they're loaning it out to somebody else, at an interest rate. So they're actually making a lot of interest on money that actually does not exist. And now that system is crumbling. So apart from that, I have no expertise in finances, except to say that the economic system was artificially created, by the banking industry. So $100 bill, when you think about it, ancient civilizations, they traded stuff that was of real value. You came to me and I bought a goat from you, and in response for that, I gave you a dozen eggs, and I gave you 14 chickens, and you can eat the produce. So we're trading stuff which is of real value. Now, if I go into the Apple store in Palo Alto, and I say I want an iPad, and here's 14 camels, and 14 donkeys, I need an iPad. They're going to laugh me out of court. And so, the value of things have changed. And so $100 bill inherently has zero value. It's a piece of paper. It's only good if you have a hole in your wallpaper and you want to paste over the hole. That's the intrinsic value. But it has no intrinsic value. Conches had value when people traded conches, they had value. You could make sound in them. When people traded goats and eggs, there was value in what they traded. Paper money has no value whatsoever. And so it's a fiat currency. It's totally made up. And so it's wedded to a Ponzi scheme, which is now beginning to disintegrate. The question is, what can we learn long term? Certainly bailing out the banks is not going to be a long-term solution to it, no matter which banks you're going to bail out. It's not a long-term solution to the Ponzi scheme, which is the economic model under which we're laboring. So we need to come up with a totally different model of somehow, creating communities which are engaging in the trading of items that have real value, that feed us or clothe us or build our homes or whatever, trading our skill sets with each other. I'll do the plumbing for you if you do the kind of the electrical work for me, that kind of a system.
My question is regarding these puzzle pieces that I have not been able to put in my big puzzle, right? And it touches on a couple of points you made in your earlier lecture regarding tunneling and maybe imprints or even touching from other dimensions. So I'll just put these out. First of all, St. Francis's stigmata, yes. Was that tunneling? Also, the conversion of Saul to St. Paul, okay. Right?
Yes.
That happened instantaneously. Right. Jude, who betrayed Christ, was he touched or whatever? And the last one is, I was listening to this Catholic priest who is an exorcist, and he said that he helped another exorcist priest cast demons from this person who turned out, the demons told him that they were the same demons that had gotten into the killers of Thomas Becket, which I found fascinating. And the way this particular priest was able to cast out those demons was this other exorcist had one relic from Thomas Becket that actually had his blood. So regarding those, is that tunneling? Is that imprint? Because they don't make sense so much to me.
So let me try and address them sequentially insofar as I can remember what you asked about, Viola. So you talked about various historical characters. You talked about St. Francis firstly and the stigmata. And it's very interesting to notice that Francis had the stigmata in the palms of his hand. Now, Jesus was not crucified in that manner. They didn't drive nails through the palms of his hand, because the human body couldn't sustain itself. You drive a nail in here, in between these muscles, these bones in the hand, and the weight of the body is going to just rip you asunder. So you couldn't support yourself. So the nails were driven through the wrists. So why did Francis have them on the palms of his hand? Because in some senses, the stigmata is a psychosomatic manifestation of the love that Francis had for whom he believed Jesus to be. And so by constant meditation on the suffering of Jesus, he was re-manifesting in his own body his perception of how Jesus was crucified. Okay? And so it was a real stigmata in the sense that he was experiencing the same kind of suffering that Jesus had, except that his model of the crucifixion wasn't accurate. And subsequently, there have been other people who've had stigmata, you know, and since that became obvious, there are now some people who manifest the stigmata where the holes and the bleeding is through the wrists. So you talked about then, like Paul on the road and the movement of from Saul to Paul. And so what was this? Paul, you know, had his encounter with Jesus many years after Jesus died. And so Paul talks himself about the fact that he came late to the party. And he's, as you know the story, he's on the journey from Jerusalem to Damascus. And his mandate is to kind of identify and persecute the young Jesus movement in Damascus, which is in Syria. And Paul was a Pharisee at that stage, totally dedicated to the Torah and the belief system in the 613 precepts of Torah. And he has this encounter in which he's blinded. And the blinding, obviously, is both a physiological phenomenon and a spiritual phenomenon. It's like Paul is going to be given a new set of eyes, a new kind of vision. And now he becomes the great kind of preacher, you know, of the Jesus movement. And so the changing of a name is very symbolic in the sense that when people understand a different mission of themselves, they'll frequently change their name. When Catholic girls enter a convent and dedicate themselves to the conventual life, they leave their old name and they adopt a new name. So a new name, and naming, as I said in a previous lecture today, naming is actually kind of the imprinting of mission. This was the identification of a mission. And so the change of name represents the fact that, you know, they're on a new mission. Jesus actually gave new names to some of the disciples. He gave a name to Simon. He called him Peter. And Peter in Latin means a rock, Petra. So he says, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. So Jesus gives a nickname to Simon by calling him Peter, because now you got a new mission. The sons of John and James, he called them Boanerges, which means literally sons of thunder, because they were going to be this really kind of dramatic preachers. So the change of a name represents a change of a self-understanding of a mission. So every time that there's this kind of a significant change, it indicates the fact that there's a new understanding of what the mission is. And remind me again, what was the fourth piece of your...
Jude. What,
okay.
Betrayal of Christ.
Betrayal of Christ. Okay. So there's a theory, for instance, that Judas was actually Jesus' best friend, and that this was actually an agreement between Jesus and Judas, that Judas would betray Jesus, and that actually Judas was the good guy, you know, and they'd set this up because Jesus was of the opinion that he needed to die on the cross in order to create this new movement. I don't believe that for a moment. I don't believe in a system that says that the bad guys are the good guys and the good guys are the bad guys. This notion that, you know, that the Hitlers and the tyrants of the world are actually volunteer to play these roles so the rest of us would have something to kind of harvest. I don't believe that at all. I believe, as I said before, that life is improv theater, and that we come down and that each individual knows the previous track histories of all the other players. And we know that the character who winds up as Hitler has a previous life history of making really poor, selfish choices or being tyrannical in his behavior. So I can't believe for a moment that Jesus said to Jesus, wink, wink, go out now and betray me. I'm ready to be crucified. You know, so I believe that, you know, we are who we are. We'll act according to our previous histories and abilities. And now the rest of us have to harvest the results of those kinds of encounters. So for me, Judas is not the good guy, you know, masquerading as the bad guy, nor is Hitler the good guy who just gave 6 million Jews an opportunity to be kind of burned alive or gassed to death. So somehow they could learn some kind of a lesson. That doesn't make any sense to me. And the last question you had to do with exorcisms and the belief system that, an exorcist, kind of assisting an exorcist was powerful because he had a relic, of, who did you say the relic was of?
Thomas Becket.
Thomas Becket, who was murdered, by the British king at some stage. What is the power of relics? Part of relics for me is the kind of the irradiation of personal belief systems and love onto an artifact. You go into like Chartres Cathedral in France, and you're bathing in the womb that has been impregnated with the devotional life of literally millions of Christian people. So it contains an energy, and that energy is really, really powerful. And so the importance of relics is not like I took a piece of blood that belonged to Thomas, Thomas Becket. I know here it is and driving out a demon with it, but that the kind of the adulation and the adoration and veneration of and the irradiation of that kind of love, it impregnates the artifacts. And we call those in Catholic theology, they're called sacramentals. So whether you're wearing kind of a scapular or a miraculous medal or whatever it might be, that you're wearing a sacramental which has been literally radiated with the love and the hope of literally millions of people throughout the Catholic history. And so if you kind of engage a dark energy with the energy of light, there's going to be the struggle. And then finally, one is going to prove to be more powerful than the other. So it's not that you just take, a vial with kind of blood and you wave it in front of a person who's possessed and bingo, the spirit says, oh, too much for me, I'm out of here. Is that you're countering one form of energy with a different form of energy, and finally, stronger energy will prevail.
I have two questions. I think one of them might be quick and it's more of a practical question, but when you talk about our unique name that has our mission encoded in it, would that be similar to like when people do transcendental meditation courses and they're given that vibrational name? I've never done it, but I've known people who have done it. Is that related?
It is very, very tangentially related, because my understanding, the TM movement is really, really powerful, but they got like 9 or 10 mantras and you have to pay to get them, and you're supposed to keep it secret, and I've had revealed to me what their particular mantras and find out that 4 or 5 different people had the same mantra. I pay money. And so mantras are really powerful, but this notion that there are special mantras that they have to sell you, if you put to work, that's for me an abuse of religion. Now, the TM method and the ability to meditate on various levels is really, really powerful. So I do not mean that when I talk about the secret sacred name, I talk about a special vibration or a special frequency that's kind of breathed into you by the Holy Spirit. Because the symbol of Pentecost is breathing spirit in. At the on the day of resurrection, according to John's Gospel, resurrection and Pentecost happen on the same day. When you read the Gospel of Luke, they happen 50 days apart. So there's according to Luke, there's Resurrection Sunday, and then there's 40 days, and then there's Ascension, and then there's 10 more days, and then there's Pentecost. In John's Gospel, they happen simultaneously. On the Resurrection Sunday, Jesus comes into the upper room where the disciples are hiding, and he says, Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you. And they're scared to think it's a ghost. He said, no, I'm serious. Shalom Aleichem, peace be with you. And then we read, he breathed upon them, and he said, receive the Holy Spirit. So there was Pentecost happening according to John's Gospel on the same day. So this breathing is another word for spirit. Breath and life and spirit are the same word in so many languages. So the Holy Spirit, in breathing into this soul on its way into incarnation, is creating this vibratory frequency. And it is that is the name, and that is the vibration, and that is the frequency. It has nothing got to do with just a mantra. It's inherent to the incarnational kind of volunteering.
My second question was my original, but I thought about the name from the last question, and it kind of relates. So you talk about the transhumanist movement, chip in the brain and all these technologies to stave off aging and death. What I'm kind of curious about is, personalities like Joe Dispenza and who's the quite Bruce Lipton, who talks about epigenetics, and Greg Brighton, who talk about other internal technologies that we have that aren't really activated, but they would still have the same type of effect, healing, anti-aging, so to speak, extending life. Do you think that even those methods, I mean, I think to go to a Joe Dispenza workshop, for example, is, in the thousands of dollars, but it's using internal technologies, not external technologies. Do you think even, focusing on those things or trying to learn those methods is also contributing to this, what we seem to have as a general fear of aging and death? Or what's your opinion on the people who are looking at exploring, enhancing our maybe natural healing technologies that we have maybe forgotten or don't tap into?
Okay, it's brilliant. You folded a whole bunch of stuff into that, Lynn. So let me try to kind of unpack it a little bit. So the first thing is that I believe that when we volunteer for incarnation, we're volunteering for a time-limited spacesuit. And that's the objective, so that we experience reincarnation again and again and again. And so that we can put ourselves in radically different kinds of configurations in order to experience, how do you love? If I'm a slave girl in North Africa in the 1300s, how do I experience, and give love? If I'm a millionaire in Silicon Valley in the 1990s, how do I experience love? So if there's not time-limited incarnation, there's no opportunity to experience radically different kinds of circumstances. So for me, I would never want to live eternally in a spacesuit. I would want to kind of have many experiences. So any technology that promises kind of eternal life, I'm not interested in this particular spacesuit. So that's off-putting for me to begin with. Now, are there technologies that can improve the quality of my health or my life or particular kinds of abilities? Obviously there are artificial things that can be done. You can have brain implants that could do that, but at the price of being a robot and being without willpower. So now the kind of the characters you've just mentioned now, are they offering technologies that could be valuable? And I would say yes. There are technologies out there that can really improve it. Now, I have a big issue, obviously, with people making a killing from those kinds of offerings. I think everybody with a gift is entitled to make a living from what they're doing, but they're not entitled to make a killing from what they're doing. We have to support ourselves, by our professions. But if our professions, are making us multimillionaires, and kind of creaming off, I got big problems with that. And so that's not to say that the technologies might not work, but that the exorbitant price you have to pay in order to be part of such a thing, that's really problematic for me. And so, what I just say is that there are technologies that work and there are techniques that can be learned, and that these, if they're working, they need to be shared, and they need to be made available to the widest possible population at the least, financial cost to the kind of the consumer. And so, we need to look into these technologies, and not let happen to them what's happened to the Catholic Church, where it's selling indulgences, in the 1500s. So you dedicate, $100 to, I think it was Pope Paul II was trying to rehab the Vatican, the kind of the St. Peter's Basilica, and sent priests all over Europe, offering indulgences. Pay $100 and you can spring a soul out of purgatory or cut your own sentence in half. And so anything that smacks of that, I got problems with. Yeah.
From what you said before about evil being evil, like a Hitler, do they just come back until they reach the goal where they should be before they recognize their true self?
That's a great question, Anne. And I think that nobody has ever lost. As I told you, he's a 5-year-old child. I wanted even the devil himself to be repatriated. And so nobody is finally ever lost. A soul can no more be separated from source than a sunbeam can be separated from the sun. It's impossible. I can put an umbrella up and I can, not feel the effects of the sun on my head, but the sun is still shining. So the same thing is true of the love of God. There's nobody who's cut off from the love of God. Ultimately, every soul is going to wake up fully. Now, how is that process, done? A part of it is reincarnation. That souls get multiple opportunities to experience, the kinds of lives their victims had experienced in other lifetimes, so they get to feel the other end of it. Maybe that's going to wake them up. There's also, I believe, the phenomenon of healing modalities after we transition from an incarnation, that there are literally souls, teachers and mentors who are dedicated healers at the other side, whose function it is to try to kind of grow the Hitlers of the world once they've transitioned, and to do some kind of healing at that level, so that when they come back in again and incarnate again, they're not coming back where they just left off, at the death of the former incarnation. So the healing modalities are open, at both sides of the veil, that they're actually great healers who are dedicated at the other side to the transitioning soul. I believe that from the experiences I've had around the dying, that people tend to die the way they lived, and people tend to transition the way they die, and people tend to experience the other side the way they transitioned. But all that is temporary. It's an evolutionary trajectory. And so eventually all souls experience total healing, because there's total realization that they're bite-sized pieces of God. And some of that is done at that side of the veil, and some of it is done at this side of the veil through reincarnation. So Leo's question was, to me personally, how do I know that I was an Indian in a past life? Because at this stage, I've managed to recover 11 past incarnations of my own, one through hypnotic regression by this friend of mine called Matt McKay, and the other in meditation experiences for myself. And so in each of these, I've only managed to recover kind of snippets of these lifetimes. It's not that I could say to you, I was born in such a date, and I lived in such a place, and I died in such a manner. But that I have like little snippets of being that other person, and realizing at the depth of my soul, that makes my soul sing in a way in which, just rational knowledge doesn't, or kind of left brain thinking doesn't. So, when you look at philosophy, there are, three ways of epistemologically knowing. So we know in one of three ways. The first one is that some expert told us, and we believed it to be true because an expert told us. The second is I experienced stuff for myself. And the third one is I figure stuff out on my own. And so epistemologically speaking, these are the three ways in which we gather data. And then we arrange them through ontology is the philosophical department that looks at how do I decide what's true of those data. How do I decide between truth and falsity there? And then thirdly, cosmology allows me to organize the data that I believe to be true into a personal philosophy of life, or a cosmology. And so for me, none of these is infallible. Experts tell us lies all the time, or make mistakes all the time. And personal experience sometimes is wrong. You go out there and you say, oh, the sun just set. Well, it didn't. It set 8 minutes ago. But light is traveling at 186,000 miles a second. It's going to take 8 minutes, for the light from the sun to reach me. So my experience says the sun set, but that's not the truth. And so personal experience can falsify data. And the same thing is true of when I work stuff out for myself. I'm working out a jigsaw puzzle. I can make mistakes and get the wrong configuration. But if I cross-fertilize the three modalities, I'm more likely to come up with the truth. And so that's what I do with these experiences, these kind of snippets. I try to bring these three modalities together, and then I tested what resonates most deeply with me, and therefore what tends to make my heart sing. And if it makes my heart sing, I'm going to believe that that's the truth. So these were snippets that came to me typically in visionary experiences during a deep meditation. Andreas was talking about being part of the Divine Mother group that believes that there are 9 different levels. So when we think about levels, this is totally kind of, in some senses, it's artificial, because it's like saying that the rainbow has 7 colors. And of course, this is millions of colors. The eye is kind of able to detect, but there's a movement between. So we see red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. In between, there are an infinite number of shades of these merging into each other. But we have to put a kind of a template over it to kind of extract a model of the field. And so it's like if you're baking cookies and you kind of create a mass of dough, and now it's baked in the oven, and you're ready to kind of, or before you bake it in the oven, you want to create particular shapes. If you take a cookie cutter that's shaped like a triangle, you're going to get triangular cookies. If you take a round one, you're going to get round cookies. If you take a square one, you're going to get square cookies. It's the same dough, and it's the same taste, it's the same thing. The shapes are different because the kind of the cookie cutter you used was a different shape. But the very same thing is true, for instance, when we think about, temperature. What's the temperature in the room right now? Depends whether you're using centigrade or Fahrenheit. How many degrees of difference are there between freezing and boiling of water, for instance? Well, it's either 100 if you're using centigrade, or it's 180 if you're using Fahrenheit. You're going from 32 to 212 in Fahrenheit. So it's the same temperature, but we're using different cookie cutters to divide it up into pieces. So now the Divine Mother is using a template of 9 different pieces. Hinduism is using a template of 7 different pieces. I've used a template of 3 different pieces. It doesn't really matter how you divide it up. What divides up is that you're somehow allowing the data to present themselves to you in a meaningful fashion that allows you to cooperate and then develop a practice that will allow you to kind of experience what's hidden, in the dough. What you want to taste is not the dough. What you want to taste is the dough. You don't want to taste the cookie cutter. You're not, biting into tin. You're biting into the cookie and not into the tin. But the problem is when you use terminology, that different teachers will use the same term to mean radically different things. So if you take, for instance, the term self, in psychology, as Freud is using the term and as Jung is using the term, they're radically different notions of the self. As mysticism is using the self, it's radically different. So we have to understand when somebody uses a term, they have to define what they mean by the term. Otherwise, I'm thinking self means this, but you're using self in that session. So when you say the astral plane, and I'm saying the astral plane, depending on which model I'm operating out of, it'll be a totally different configuration. So we have to understand the terminology of the people, which is part of the language difficulty of understanding the terminology of the speaker and unpacking it in different ways. Okay, 2 great questions. The first one is, the Big Bang, was that the actual beginning? Or was there anything before? The problem is when you ask a scientist this, you ask an astronomer this question, what existed before the Big Bang? And they'll tell you nothing existed before the Big Bang, because time came into being with the Big Bang, and space came into being with the Big Bang, and matter came into being with the Big Bang, and energy came into being. So there was neither time, space, energy, nor matter before the Big Bang. So don't ask me that question. It's a dumb question. This is what they'll tell you. If you say, what happened? Where did the Big Bang happen? There was no place for it to happen, and there was no time in which it happened because time hadn't been invented yet. It was invented by the Big Bang, and space didn't exist yet. It was invented by the Big Bang. And so you're winding yourself down into a conundrum. And so you have to step outside the physical world completely to understand, is there an origin? And I want to try and kind of separate the word origin from time, a timeline. Is there some kind of an origin? And the origin for me is kind of trans-physical. It's way beyond physicality. That there had to be some source out of which manifestation emerged. But that manifestation means that it pre-existed. And now I'm stuck with a kind of a language of time again. And so it's like this famous Chinese conundrum where the emperor brings in this wise elder and says to him, on what is the world resting? And the elder says, it's standing on the back of a great big elephant, emperor. Okay. And what's the elephant standing on? Well, the elephant is standing on the back of a great big lion. Okay. And on what is the lion standing? The lion is standing on the back of a great big turtle. Okay. And on what is the turtle standing? From there on down is turtles all the way. Yeah. So you back yourself into a conundrum that you can't answer because, you're stepping outside of time. And that's where altered states of consciousness take us. Not to kind of just play with that image for a little bit. It is possible, I think, that, the Big Bang is actually a white hole. And so that when a galaxy is sucked into a black hole, it takes all of the information, sucks it in, and blows it out at the other side. I'm going to call it a white hole, and it recombines itself either into the same manifestation or a totally different combination of the factors. And so that what we regard as the Big Bang was basically a white hole that's regurgitating matter that had been sucked in a previous universe or a previous level of reality. And I use the example of, I remember as a child watching a kind of a visitor come to our home, and it was lashing rain, and he's holding an umbrella. And he comes into the house, and he collapses the umbrella and he shakes it outside and brings it in. And then he's visiting for about an hour. And then when he's finished, he takes the umbrella, he goes out and he inflates the umbrella. And so it's the same umbrella afterwards as before. The umbrella with which he leaves the house was the umbrella with which he entered the house. So that's one version, that the black hole is simply regurgitating all of the matter that it sucked in, and re-inflating the umbrella at the other side. So the dudes at the other side, I think there's a big bang and it's all happening now. And it didn't just happen now, it's inflating right now. And the other possibility is that the black hole didn't just suck the matter in and then regurgitate it in the same form at the other side, but that it recombined the elements and produced a totally different kind of a universe at the other side. In the same way that Helioprigogine is talking about recombining the elements, or the same way that Shiva energy is dismantling the original configuration and reconfiguring it differently. So that's a possibility then, that, the Big Bang is only a form, it's an origin story from a singularity which can't be described in space or time or energy or matter, because they may not have existed, at the other end. And your second question then was about what about starseed then, and the fact that we definitely are starseed. So we're kind of denizens of an existing cosmos, and which is at this stage about 14.6 billion years of age. So there are parts of this cosmos which are literally 3 times older than planet Earth. But what happened is that, as whatever created this universe of ours, that there was an original kind of generation of stars, the first stars, but eventually they all went supernova. That through a process of nuclear fusion, they burned up all their matter and they exploded, and they scattered their molecular structure into outer space. And then these began to coagulate as new galaxies, a second generation of galaxies, and then matter within the galaxies coagulated as solar systems, and matter within solar systems coagulated as planets, and etc. And so that is the same primal matter in a sense, and it's been scattered throughout. And some of that landed on planet Earth, and some of it landed elsewhere. So in some senses, we're all star seeds. We all come from matter that existed since the beginning. But that perhaps there are beings who are landed in different planets or in different dimensions, that are much older than we, and that have much greater technologies that don't need physicality even, technologies of, extraordinary spiritual insights and technological know-how, and that they may be coming in at this stage and influencing the trajectory of life on planet Earth right now. And so you get people who make the claim, I'm a starseed, I'm from outer space. And I'd say, yeah, welcome to the family. We're all from outer space, every single one of us. So we're all starseeds in that sense. Yeah. Kevin is talking about the fact that inner space and outer space are the same thing, and that they're connected with each other, and that the soul is something like the conduit between the two pieces. Is that correct? Is it correctly? So, so you got kind of, in some senses, maybe the soul is actually a black hole that's connecting 2 levels of reality. A kind of an inner reality and an outer reality. That's a great image. So the soul is a black hole in the sense that blackness is the womb. That in Celtic mythology, for instance, we talk about, that there's not a battle between light and dark. That for the Celts and for the Hebrews as well, the day began at sunset. Yeah. And the year began, and on Samhain, October 31st, when the dark period is happening. And so we go into the dark times, but darkness represents the womb, the fertile, fecund womb, out of which everything, emerges eventually. So then it is the darkness that gives birth to the light. It's not that the darkness is swallowing the light, it's birthing light. So if the soul is the meeting point between inner and outer, reality, then maybe it's a dark hole, that the soul is actually a dark hole. It's a womb that's gestating light of various kinds.